got her PhD from the University of Venice, but now teaches in Sydney, and her research focuses on contemporary Middle East and North African cultural histories and on gender and women's studies. Before joining the University of Sydney, she's taught in several Italian universities and published extensively on the history of the Egyptian feminist movement.
I would like to start by thanking my colleagues, in particular Professor Marinelli, for organizing this panel and for taking us in a wonderful, emotional and intellectual journey in this day. I start my paper with a discussion on the definitions through which the events happening in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain and Syria have been discussed in both general media and scholarly sources. According to the American historian James Garvin, the media's favorite phrase, Arab Spring, has proven to be not only incorrect, but also misleading. The term awakening has been used by other scholars, among the others by Tariq Ramadan, in order to attempt a historical comparison with previous seasons of regime change in the Arab world, namely the modernist and anti-colonial movements between the 19th and the 20th century, and the popular uprisings followed by military coups in the 50s. The idea of an alleged awakening has been, however, rejected, first of all by Egyptian scholars and activists, on the basis that it assumes that before the 2010 and 2011 events, they were all sleeping. Instead, as Professor Lubna Youssef has underlined in the opening session of this symposium, the revolution was in the air, and Egyptian intellectuals, women and men, were well awake long before the 21st of January. Therefore, awakening, a word that a whole generation of historians has widely used, and not only in English. In Arabic we talk about the Risorgimento and the Second Risorgimento and etc. A word does not reflect the actual reality of a decade of violent mobilization throughout the region, which was shaped by the Second Palestinian Intifada, the protests against the war and occupation of Iraq, the Israeli aggression of Lebanon, the movement Kifaya, and the Labour movement strikes in Egypt. As political scientist Rabab al-Mahdi has pointed out, under a regime of violent repression, people were not sleeping, rather they were acting underground, and the fact that opposition movements were not appearing does not mean that they did not exist. This is a key issue in the field of women's activism. Political scientists are also skeptical about the use of the term revolution, and they affirm that the fall of a dictator is not necessarily a revolution when it does not imply a radical structural change, and especially when the leadership of the new regime is not made by the revolutionaries. For all these reasons, the word uprising seems to be the one around which more widespread consensus gather round. With reference to the Egyptian case, I think that the term revolution is instead suitable, and what I learned in the last 3 days reinforces my idea. If we abandon the traditional theoretical framework of the mainstreaming political science, and we think of revolution as a process and not as an event. The idea has been conveyed during the symposium by recurrent references to the idea of a Thawra Mustamira, the continuing revolution, which I found appropriate, especially with reference to gender and women's history. The thesis that I want to share with you, and which is part of my research project, is that feminism is the continuing revolution of Egypt, and that narrating is the performative act through which women, over more than 1 century of cultural, social, and political activism, have enacted their revolution. Paraphrasing Eric Osborne, I would argue that feminism is the only successful revolution of 20th century Egypt. Thinking about revolution as a process and not as a fact implies an epistemological shift and the necessity to extend the timeline covered by our analysis. We need to think about a process which is rooted in the past and it is projected toward the future. The revolutionary process in Egypt is rooted in the avant-garde activities of dissident movements since the 60s, and it flourished with Kifaya, and it is still ongoing. It is telling that the novels which made the canon of dissidents, and in these days we have listened to analysis of Children of the Alleys, for example, by Nadir Mahfouz, but also other novels like The Committee, Tsunami Rahim, among many others, are gaining today new popularity and are again on the first line in the bookshops' windows. The revival of the literature of dissidents includes also women's literature, and one of my students brought to my attention a blogger, an Egyptian blogger who called herself Leila, with explicit reference to the main character of Latif al-Zayyad's novel, The Open Door. The revolution has been imagined before it happened, and the fact that it has been imagined made it happen. The second caution that we need to take when we adopt the term revolution is the necessity to abandon the usual path of top-down analysis and to assume a perspective from below, focusing on the discourses of informal groups and on cultural change rather than institutions. The campaigns organized by grassroots organizations and spontaneous groups against sexual harassment are key examples, showing that after 30 years of ineffective government policies failing in directly addressing the problem, women's organizations address gender violence from below, mobilizing people against sexual harassments and assaults. In this paper, I underline that the engagement of these organizations is not new, as most of them have been acting at least in the last 10 years, not even before. But the cultural impact of their action has long been overlooked and underestimated. Given this theoretical background, my analysis is grounded in Egyptian women's history and developed through the interviews that I have collected during a short field work in Cairo in November and December 2011, in the weeks between the Muhammad Mahmoud street uprisings and the first 2 rounds of parliamentary elections. The historical and cultural analysis challenges 2 widespread misconceptions about women and politics in Egypt, and per extension in the Arab world. The first misconception is that women's activism starts with the 2011 uprisings. In order to deconstruct this wrong idea, it is useful to recall that Egyptian women political activism throughout the 20th century, shedding light on continuities and changes. The second prejudice is that women's underrepresentation is not quasi-absence from the new elected and later suspended parliament mirrors their absence from the political field, confirming the alleged traditional misogyny of the so-called Arabic culture. In this study, I argue that this gap is in representation, but not in participation. Therefore, it does not reflect women's absence from the political sphere, but rather an inherent inadequacy of traditional institutions to represent them alongside other subjects. And this is an issue which does not refer only to Egypt. Furthermore, the quasi-absence of women from the new elected and later suspended parliament is emblematic of wider class and generational mechanism of exclusion, revealing that what we are witnessing is not an accomplished democracy yet, but a process still ongoing. Now I will focus on the relationship between history and present Egypt from the perspective of gender and women history, showing that the lesson of John Scott, when she asserts that gender is a useful category of historical analysis, is relevant to our case studies. Why the analysis of feminist theories and practice in Egypt today cannot do without thinking about the revolutionary context in which they stand The contrary is also true. It is unlikely understanding the Egyptian revolution unless we understand that it is gender. The Egyptian revolution has challenged an inherently patriarchal regime, where an oligarchy proved to be increasingly unable to meet the expectations and the needs of its young population, whose frustrations were increased day by day. We could say that, insofar feminism and the critique of gender are challenging the patriarchal order and are challenging relations of power based on a system of symbols that values masculinity and primogeniture, the Egyptian revolution is also a feminist revolution. This does not mean that its protagonist makes gender equality a priority. On the contrary, young women of Tahrir Square, for the most part, does not refer to any of the Egyptian and international feminist theories in their policy and formulations. As Hala Kamal has discussed in her presentations 2 days ago, even in creative writing, feminism is not explicitly claimed. The young women who have taken part in the occupations, to the collectives and the revolutionary committees, which from there were born, they are not acting in the name of gender equality, but of the goals that they share with all the protesters: freedom, justice, and dignity. However, these political practices, occupations, collectives, and committees are part of the feminist practices. And most of them are aware that the revolution has changed their lives forever. Taking to the streets, these young women have disobeyed 3 times. They disobeyed to the president, who paternalistic toned through young people to return home. They disobeyed to the army and to their parents. After this initiation to disobedience, Egypt does not go back. Not only because some of the taboos were challenged, but also because new behaviors are the result of 1 century of feminism. A history which perhaps is not well known, if not in the widening circle of feminist historians, but which allowed, generation after generation, the spread of new social practices and new sensibilities. We all remember the video posted on YouTube by Asma Mahfouz. The young woman of the 6th of April movement encouraged her fellow citizens to take to the streets on 25th of January. If you consider yourself a man, and I'm quoting, come with me on January 25. Instead of saying that women should not come because they will be beaten, let's show a bit of honor, be men, and come with me on January 25. End of the quote. Who's that girl? Although she's perhaps one of the most famous in the West, Asma is not an exception in the landscape of youth Egyptian activism. She uses the key word of the revolution, dignity and social justice. She says several times kifaya, which means that's enough, but which is also the name of the movement active since 2004. More importantly, she appropriates the words of the patriarchal culture, honor, manhood, protection, and she reinvents them to claim her right as a young Egyptian woman to invite people to the protest. This action of appropriation and reinvention of the words of the oppressor, in this case the patriarchal culture, by the dissident, is also part of the Egyptian feminist heritage. In an essay published in the late 90s, the prominent writer Nawal Sadawi refers to the intrinsic dissidence of the creative world and the language of imperialism and oppression which authors have forged into an instrumental of liberation. Time is running, so I want to finish. I go quickly to the conclusions because we don't have time. An important stake in the discussion of the Egyptian revolution, which take us to the history, is the politics of self-representation. And here again, we can find an important inheritance in the historical Egyptian feminism. In May 1923, Hoda Sha'rawi, the founder and the president of the Egyptian Feminist Union, which has been extensively studied by Margot Badran, participated in the International Suffragist Conference in Rome, and she gave several speeches and discussions referring to the self-representation. And when she described her aim in participating in this conference, she underlined, as we can see in this quote, the need to show the Egyptian woman to the European ones who does know her or have false information. Unfortunately, I don't have here with me the source, but it would be interesting to compare these sources with the Italian newspapers and how they represented Hoda Sha'rawi and the Egyptian delegations in the same days. Now, there was a whole play of misrepresentations. She was called a beautiful Bedouin woman, white woman. Come on, there was the representation of the Egyptians, but also the Japanese and other delegations was completely orientalized. I think that this kind of problem is still present in current representation of women's activism in these revolutions, especially representations coming from outside, and that one of the main challenges is to contrast this kind of representations, and that history can help us in overcoming this gap. Today, and I really conclude, women and men of Egypt are facing many challenges. To imagine and to perform new gender roles is part of these challenges. If we look at grassroots movements, there are signs that people are ready. The challenge is to change the political leadership and the mentalities. The importance of historicizing the women experience, framing in the context of feminist historiography, it's important to understand the present and the history of Egypt. The Egyptian experience is inclusive, and women cross all the categories of this inclusiveness. Indeed, I would like to conclude with a quote by Antonio Gramsci, and asserting that feminism today requires to practice the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the bullet.